This is Youth Work, the podcast that delves into the lives of youth workers, their journey and their work with young people. Welcome. So this is Youth Work, the podcast that delves into the life of youth workers, their journeys and their work with young people. So welcome. I'm joined by Nick and Chris, two Youth Work titans and legends I've known for a few years now, and we get on really well. So we thought we'd invite them in for a podcast. So welcome Nick and Chris. You both okay?
Yeah, very good. Very good. And yourself?
You know, it's Friday, so always really good. How's things for you, Chris? All good?
Good to be here, Dan. Yeah, Friday, week and a half away from Christmas or whatever.
Yeah.
All good.
I suppose this might class as the Christmas special.
Hey.
The
Good.
Youth Homelessness Christmas special, which is, somewhat depressing as a title, but obviously it's a real problem that we have in the UK and obviously in Wales. So so obviously the title is Youth Homelessness Podcast today, but clearly you guys have been in the sector for a while now, similar to myself, and it'd be good to sort of understand your journeys that you've taken from, and you can start to, wherever you want to start with into present day, just to give us a bit of context in terms of who we're listening to, really. And then we'll go on to the youth homelessness side of stuff a little bit later, because we do want to unpack that a little bit in terms of what we do here in Wales and what you guys do in your provisions and things like that. So, Chris, if it's okay with you, can I start with you in terms of your background and what's led you to this point? And you can go back as far as you want. You can go from birth if you like. Up to you, but feel free to give us a flavour of, how you got to this position here.
That would be going back a while. Yeah, in terms of youth work, one of my teachers said you would be good at this, and that's where I first had the inkling about youth work.
Right.
And I started working in leisure services, and I changed roles to work with social services, which freed me up in the evenings. And I
Yeah.
contacted that teacher and said, any opportunities? And following that, I got into part-time youth work. 3 years later, I got my first full-time job with the YMCA in Bridgend. Worked with the youth service in Bridgend up until 2000, doing all sorts of things, gaining experience in all youth work areas. 2001, I went to Carmarthenshire as one of the senior officers there. Stayed there 16 years in developing lots of stuff around Carmarthenshire. Really enjoyed my time there. One of the key areas of work that I really enjoyed was post-16 work, which has always been my leaning toward.
Yeah.
And the role of youth work in post-16 work involving education, employment, training and youth homelessness, I've seen gradually increase over the years. I've been with Powys now for five years, coming up to 6 years. And my role here is work with a team of colleagues. We call the detached team. And we work with young people around the youth engagement progression framework areas, which is education, employment, and training, and youth homelessness. So I wear both those hats as well as the detached manager's hat, call it, for Powys. And we've got a team of about 18 staff which work across Powys. It sounds massive, but Powys is a quarter of Wales, so we need a big team to cover such a large area. But we do some really good work. And we're out in the communities, in young people's homes, working with them wherever they are to try and help them make a successful transition from being a young person into a young adult, able to make good decisions, able to know that they're supported, and hopefully give them a good backstop in life and opportunities to move forward from. So I think that catches us really.
So you've had quite a broad experience going from sort of three sort of areas, I suppose, of Wales. Now you're in the sort of, mid-eastern sort of quarter of Wales, and Powys, you're right, is huge. For those who don't know, what is the Youth Engagement and Progression Framework? What is that, and what do you have to do towards that? Why? I'm just conscious that people might not know what that is. And then a further question I've got then, you mentioned detached, you sort of managed detached. And one of the big sort of things in youth work in Wales is outreach and detached. So, I'm quite curious to how you're just focused on detached and why that is. So if we go back to the initial question, sorry, that's quite a big, broad question I've asked you there, Chris.
So the first bit was the Youth Engagement Progression Framework.
Yeah.
That's a Welsh Government initiative which has been developed just under 10 years. And it's grown in development. And in the last 2 years, youth homelessness has been added to that sort of brief as well, which is really useful. So lots of people know of the term neat in the field. We tend to hate the term because it's a label for young people
Yeah.
old enough to. And I remember we did a project years ago in partnership with Swans, when it was in Bridgend, in partnership with Swansea, but underneath Batalman, and it was called Sick of Zero. And it was called Sick of Zero Status because young people not in education, employment, or training were deemed as having zero status.
Yeah.
Howard Williamson wrote a paper about it, in fact. And it's evolved from there, but recognizing, I think the Welsh Government recognised that when young people are in school, they've got a
Yeah.
collective group that they can address. As soon as they leave school, they go in a whole range of directions, and picking them up and getting in touch with them after that is a massive challenge. So the Youth Engagement Progression Framework is basically looking at a tier list of where young people are in terms of their development and whether they are known and we know what they're doing and we know that they've got a training plan or pathway, or whether they don't. We deal with tier 1 and tier 2 in that, and our role is essentially working with Careers Wales, with
Yeah.
school, and with all the information that we have to hopefully contact those young people, to reach out to find out what they need, and hopefully create a pathway for them to get into education, employment, or training,
Yeah.
and hopefully hold their hand, get them to where they need to be, give them those opportunities, and essentially give them the choices for them to make the decisions in terms of what they want to do.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because, obviously the Youth Engagement and Progression Framework isn't a youth work specific policy area in Welsh Government, but it's something that we have a huge responsibility for, isn't it? So I'd be keen to sort of unpack, what specifically, why are youth workers better at, not better, sorry, why are they tasked with supporting Youth Engagement Progression Framework, in your
What
opinion?
I found was, particularly over the time that I was in Carmarthenshire,
Mm.
our role in that area, first of all, increased by natural osmosis, really. But then, secondly, it began to be recognised by Welsh Government in terms of, hang on, the relationship youth workers have can be really useful in this agenda. So that's where it came from, I think. And the key thing is, we can say to people, look, you haven't got to work with us. You
Yeah,
choose to work with us. We can
yeah,
help you. We have means, we have ways, and we have the skills to be able to create and help you with opportunities, but you haven't got to.
yeah,
Youth work is probably unique in that respect because we deal with some really heavy issues,
yeah,
but the young people choose to work with us. It's voluntary engagement at its heart, built on rapport, empathy, trust, understanding, and from that, the development of a really positive relationship, then we're able to work with a young person, and we use quite often their interests to engage them in working with us. So if they've got an interest in football, let's use that as a tool to engage. And sometimes it's crisis stuff, it's problems they're having. Sometimes it's really nice stuff, in terms of really positive interests and things that we can help them develop in terms of pastimes or whatever. But all those allow us to work with young people on their terms and hopefully help them make that, like I said earlier, that transition from being a young person into a young adult, able to make really good choices. And hopefully the choices that they make will be right for them at the time. But quite often they don't know all the opportunities and the choices that are available. So they can go down particular pathways, not realizing there may be other options. And just to finish off, I think Welsh Government recognised the value of that role. And it started with youth engagement, tier
yeah,
list work, working with careers, and it's blended into youth homelessness for exactly the same reasons. And what is really helpful for us as well is that we don't, in Powys, our age remit for detached is 16. So we work with young people in year 11 from mid, and then we can work with them up until their 26th birthday. So we use the full European remit of a young person being up to the age of 25, and that's inclusive of their 25th year. No other services can do that. Quite often you'll have a cut-off at 18, which
yeah,
is so
yeah,
often crazy because the young person may have developmental issues, may have really
yeah.
bad experiences, trauma issues or whatever. And just because they turn 18 doesn't give them all those skills that they need to make really good pathways in life.
I,
So yeah, I think it works well for us.
You summed that up really well. And if anyone didn't know the Youth Engagement and Progression Frameworks, by listening to that, they surely do now. So, you spoke about that really well. And I suppose that leads you into the detached question that I sort of asked you, because you mentioned about detached and the sort of age thresholds and how that can benefit youth work. I'm a full advocate as well of the sort of 11 to 25 stretch and it not being segregated, and we have that through fair. But yeah, obviously I picked up on a point that you're a detached manager, not an outreach and detached manager, and I wonder what that is and what's the value of detached work in youth work?
So for me, the difference between detached, and I used to manage detached projects in Bridgend years ago and in
Yeah,
command. Detached for me just means not use of buildings. We don't have a base. We work in the communities where the young people are. The role of detached in Powys is very much around working with those young people in their own communities around the areas that I just described in terms of helping young people in education, employment, training, and addressing homelessness. But not just homelessness, because if we just wait for young people to become homeless, then we're going to have a massive, massive issue,
yeah,
because the key is prevention. The key is early recognition in terms of if they're going to become homeless, what we can do to maybe work with colleagues in making that good for that young person where they are, or addressing it before they actually become homeless. Um, so in terms of detached, we work on young people's terms in the communities where they live. We use local shops, cafes, libraries to meet up with young people, quite often in their own homes, quite often in rural communities where young people are really isolated as well.
mm,
And I think that's part of the reason why the detached project or program in Powers has been so successful, is that
yeah.
we don't feel, basically we've got colleagues in a car working in all areas with young people who want to work with us, and some of the issues we deal with are really scary in terms of
Mm,
those, the issues the young people face.
yeah.
But being able to respond, being able to have that contact with them, and just to finish off, our work is incredibly multi-agency. I've just come from a meeting now with police officers, homelessness officers, complex needs officers,
Mm,
and colleagues from my team. Quite often we'll have mental health colleagues there. Quite often we'll have NHS colleagues there. We even get pulled into meetings into ward meetings where we've got a young person who is being detained under the Mental Health Act. So we deal with all sorts of stuff like that. And what's happened in the last, since I've joined the service, really, it's gradually increased. But the value of our work in helping other colleagues do their work as well. We've really been recognised as being a key contributor and key player for the local authority, which is great to see.
I want to pick up on that point a little bit later, because I find that fascinating that that youth work are very much seen as this sort of collaboration space that sometimes is unusual for other service areas. I just want to bring in Nick. So Nick, yeah, welcome. It's been
Hey, folks.
taken us a while to get to you
It's
because
all right.
to be fair to Chris, he's given us some really broad
Yeah.
and detailed answers. But it's fair to say, Nick, that you haven't always been in the youth work sector, and you've had a somewhat different experience to Chris to sort of begin your career, and now you're into to youth work. So
Yeah.
explain a bit your journey and how you've got to where you
Yeah.
are now.
Well, I suppose I found my way into youth work through another career. So I was in the army for a number of years in the finest Welsh Cavalry Regiment. Well, there's only one Welsh Cavalry Regiment, but the finest cavalry regiment ever. But then as I was transitioning out to that and planning to exit the army, I was based in mainly barracks in Cardiff and on what was called the regimental information team, and we'd done a lot of things to go out. My job was to recruit people into the army, really. The information that we were giving out for that purpose, but we had some interactions with cadet forces, which my regiment sponsored down here in West Wales and so on. You'll be aware, Darryl. There's a camp that goes on at Kimmel
Yeah,
Bay, and so I was drawn into that through the army, and I just found it fascinating that the way to engage young people, and you could help shape their minds and so on, and just the learning I went through them as well. And I'd been in the army for quite a few years by then, and so it was never on my radar to have a career in the youth sector. I had, as a child, experienced quality youth work, though. I grew up in Cwmbran, and I had a teacher at the time. By day, he was a teacher, but night, he used to work in our youth club, and he transitioned that really well. And it was fascinating to see. And, as I pursued my journey through youth work, I really reflected on his ability to transcend both those jobs, but put disparity between the two, but really kind of for the benefit of young people. So it really influenced his teaching abilities as well. So I'd had that point of reference, but never kind of thought I'd pursue it myself. And then coming out of the army, I knew that my time in the army is coming to an end. Was I going to do 22 years or not? And I thought, no, but what next? And anyway, so fast forward, and then I got a job with a third sector organisation down here in Pembrokeshire, which was a baptism of fire, but it was brilliant. Very very much traditional youth work, youth centre based. Saturday night discos with 150 young people attending and stuff. But it was brilliant. Again, that got me into, I started pursuing, funding is always a challenge in the third sector, and that was a challenge. And that was really what initiated my move over to the local authority. But I've been with the local authority now in the youth service for 20 odd years. I started running youth clubs, youth centres. I was a community-based youth worker, so you managed youth centres. I managed a number of youth centres, and then set up different projects. Chris has already alluded to the dreaded neat title, but aimed at engaging people in education, employment, training in the daytime. I did some prevention projects. We merged with the youth justice team, so I went along and complemented my youth and community degree with youth justice, effective practice certificates, and so on to broaden. So I've done some prevention projects there until I find myself here now today in terms of working on a homelessness agenda. And I think every one of those roles helped me build foundations and cemented the fact that I think there was a big concern both within the sector and outside the sector of, well, why youth work and why youth homelessness. But the foundation, coming into working on this agenda, is youth work. Like any other form of youth work, there's a core of what we do as youth workers that can be applied in any setting, isn't it? As Chris had so articulately put. So so that's the very briefest journey of how I find myself here, 20 odd years on, still working in the youth work sector, and it's still changing, adapting. There's contemporary issues that this work that we'll go on to talk about wasn't on anyone's radar 10 years ago, sort of thing. So it's in terms of professionals or people thinking and considering a pathway into youth work, it'll constantly change, it'll constantly adapt, and it's really stimulating for those reasons.
It's interesting, that there's a massive link between those who served in the armed forces and homelessness, and
Yeah.
that sort of unique role, really, isn't it, in terms of that preventive role with young people, isn't it, Nick?
Yeah, you're right. And it's difficult, and sometimes there are some comparisons I've made. When you leave the forces, a very rigid system, and you've had things done to you rather than along with you, And in a sense, and it's not being derogatory about, but young people who make the transition, they've been from a place of dependency on someone, on a school system, on parents, on guardians, and so on. So to then find yourself in a position, and some people that's accelerated,
Yeah.
they're not planning to make this change as quickly as possible. To go from a place of dependence to independence in a very short period of time for some people is really problematic, and
Yeah.
there's clear synergy between that and, like you said, the history of kind of how people have come in and out of the armed forces as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I find it fascinating. Obviously, myself being in the reserve unit, obviously we don't see that big. Well, we see the sort of rigidness, but we obviously go back home to our sort of unstructured lives, I suppose. Whereas in the armed forces, very structured, isn't it? You're told when to wake up, when to have your breakfast, when to have your lunch.
Yeah,
Not so much toilet times, but there's only so many free periods that you're able to have.
yeah,
Mm,
yeah.
it's sort of, it's not institutionalization, but you do become accustomed to that institution and
Yeah,
that way of working, isn't it?
absolutely. And The very purpose of the youth work sector is to aid that transition for young people from a place of dependency into independence. And hopefully, and Chris had alluded to this earlier, hopefully we get that luxury of, we're in a unique position. We do work with 11 to 25-year-olds. That's well positioned. And, we're present at that very transitional period of their life when a lot of changes are happening. But it is a luxury some people get, to make that slow transition from 11 to 25. Some people it's very accelerated. And I think that's the area in terms of the homelessness stuff. That's the area that we're working in, that when that transition period is reduced greatly,
Yeah.
that becomes really problematic.
I think you both touched upon this really, and obviously we spoke at length already about youth homelessness, and about homelessness in general. But automatically, when you hear the term homelessness, you picture someone that isn't in a home, that they're
Yeah.
living on the streets, living rough. But that isn't always the case. I've known that obviously working in Newport and Monmouthshire, that actually that's not rare as such, but it's that most of the work around that preventative agenda. And I'm just curious in terms of what the actual work is, in terms of, what do you do with young people to prevent? And do you see people living rough? And if so, how do you sort of respond to that? And, how do they get themselves, not to get themselves, how do they find themselves in that position? And it's quite a scary position, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you think of your home as being your safety and security, whether you live with family or not, you've got that sort of inner sanctum, that's that safety of those four walls, that you might not have. So, what is homelessness? I suppose my question to both of you, and what are we currently doing about it?
I think, I know Chris will have lots to say on this, and just for me to pick up on the language you just used then about safety, that's where we start, isn't it?
Yeah.
People think homelessness is, they often confuse it for rooflessness, which is a form of it, but it's the most extreme end. But homelessness is not having a safe, secure, and stable place to live. Now, you could be homeless, but under a roof. Do you know what I mean? Because there's lots of terms, sofa surfing. It's kind of people use, and for people, there's lots of different language, but you know, if someone is staying somewhere and it's not secure, for instance, in the sense that they haven't got a contract, an occupation contract that says these are the terms you stay there, so long as you adhere to this contract, then you can stay here. So it could be just staying at friends. People don't think they're homeless if they're just staying on a friends. And we use the term sofa surfing. That can be misleading, because people think, well, no, I'm staying at a friend's and they got a spare room
Yeah.
and, bed. So it's not always sofa surfing. Well, that's great. But then if at any point, whoever they're staying with can turn around and go, we've had enough of that, off you go.
Yeah.
What? Okay, so that's not secure. Safe being, they could be at threat of something. We work with a lot of vulnerable young people who, they're witnessing, you know, violence, abuse in their home. If they don't feel safe in that home, that comes under the agenda as well. That comes under a definition of homelessness. If they're at threat, they could be living somewhere, and then the landlord might have legally said, okay, they've given them enough terms of notice to say you've got to leave by this date. So the period, roughly 56 days, if you're at threat of becoming homeless in 56 days, you can present to your local authority as homeless. But that's, people again often confuse homelessness for rooflessness. It doesn't mean, at the moment, it can mean rough sleeping.
Yeah.
And we're seeing an increase on that locally down here. Unfortunately, we are seeing an increase in that. But a lot of people have this image of homelessness. They've gone to an urban hub. They walk around
Yeah.
the city and they see poor, kind of, when I mean poor, I mean, unfortunate people on the streets and things. But
And
that's the tip of the iceberg. There's
yeah.
lots at threat of living in insecure properties, having got a contract, and so on. I'll let Chris come in.
No, I'm fascinated by that. I'm going to ask Chris another question now, because Pembrokeshire powers are sort of similar in terms of their wealth status, not wealth, but financial status. When you
Yeah,
look, when you compare yourselves to like inner city areas such as Newport, Cardiff, Swansea, that are very, urbanised and built up. But you guys are still experiencing youth homelessness. Obviously, in Newport, Cardiff, it's quite visible in that you can see homelessness where you see temporary tents made up, doors. But that's not what we're dealing with on a larger scale, isn't it? you know, you guys are very much still experiencing, despite they're not in an urban area, you know, the risk, the sheer risk of youth homelessness. They are at threat, I suppose, aren't they, of not having that stability and security. And I wonder, from your perspective, Chris, from like a detached perspective, in terms of what you're seeing, and is it slightly different to what Nick's experiencing?
It's not. The counties are similar, just the powers is bigger, that's all. The sparseness is a real challenge for anybody living there. And what is also forgotten is that by nature of being rural, everything's more expensive. When you look at prices driving through and see them escalate because the petrol's got to be taken there. Shops are smaller. So obviously you don't have the big, massive superstores there. So things tend to be more expensive. Transport is an issue in terms of getting round. Public transport's been cut ridiculously. Young people living in villages that can only work on a Thursday, for example, because that's the day the bus comes. So how are they supposed to have the same opportunity as somebody living in an urban area? We did some research with Neville, who's our drug services commissioner. For some young people living in the county, you've got a 8-hour round trip to access an appointment.
Yeah,
Work that out, 4 hours in terms of using public transport to get from A to B for a 20-minute appointment and then to come back. If they miss it, that's the whole day gone.
yeah,
So those challenges just don't get experienced. And of course, there's a cost to that as well.
yeah,
So in relation to homelessness across the county, there are some significant issues with availability of property. I think that's one of the key factors in terms of suitable accommodation for people, and also tied with it is affordability as well, because that's a big question in terms of yes, it's all very well having some form of income, but if the income doesn't meet the needs of the bills that are going to come in, then that is a challenge. We see the causes for homelessness, quite often family breakdown, quite often the young people that we're working with are mirroring, or I suppose, examples of experiences the parents or family members have had.
yeah,
But quite often they're passed on,
yeah,
maybe to do with domestic violence, and maybe to do with the family being homeless or the family having challenges. Crowding is another issue that we see.
yeah,
It's not uncommon for us to work with young people who are sleeping on a mattress in the living room floor and they go to bed when everybody else goes to bed.
yeah, yeah,
So those sorts of situations, and the suitability of a premises for a young person to live and develop in a way which will allow them to have a really, really good experience of life and what it's all about, as opposed to so many young people living in now day by day, fending off today's problems and not really worrying about tomorrow
yeah,
because that's too far away to consider.
yeah, yeah,
So we see all sorts of issues. We see young people who've run away from family environments who end up in Powys. We see young people who've moved to Powys, possibly families have gone elsewhere then and the young people have stayed. So there's a whole range of reasons. And we do a lot of work with young people coming through the care system as well, who
yeah.
who also have those challenges.
So I think it's fair to say then that they're vulnerable young people, aren't they? For whatever reason, they are vulnerable, probably not because of their own choosing. But it was interesting. I was listening to a political podcast recently, and someone used the term elective homelessness. And I'm not sure that's a positive term to say things. I don't think people choose to be homelessness, but I think they might make the decision to leave a family home, but ultimately that was never going to be sustainable for that or person to stay in such a rough accommodation, or whether they are living domestic violence situations or they're seeing substance misuse. Again, I don't think people or young people at the very most choose to be homelessness, and I'm not sure if that's part of the narrative that you hear in your sort of local authority areas, not so much from the local authority themselves but around them, about people choosing to sort of do these things when actually we're thinking of, we're looking at quality of life here, aren't
Yeah,
we?
yeah,
They obviously have made a decision based on probably poor options given to them, isn't it? And obviously they see themselves being safer, not being what probably would have been classed as that safe and
yeah.
secure sort of network. Sorry, Nick, go for it.
just to say, yeah, there are terms that are used in the system, such as intentionally homeless and
Right.
intentionality. So if someone is makes themselves intentionally homeless, the housing system, and their legislation allows for a local authority to discharge their responsibility, their duty, what's classed as their duty, to help. Now, and this is where uh, some of the things that both you fellas said earlier is important, and what I think we bring to the table. It's relationship based what we do in the youth work sector, so we can contextualize that. Someone who is refusing to go home, the housing officers, to be fair, it's no
Yeah.
housing officer will want to make someone homeless or what not want to support someone who is homeless. But sometimes they've got huge caseloads and they got to look at it, and so they'll phone, I don't know, let's take a hypothetical scenario. They'll phone parents and the parents will go, yeah, they can come home.
Yeah.
Okay. So what? Yeah, but if they're choosing not to, well, that's intentional homeless, and we won't offer them temporary accommodation. Now, we all know there's a range of factors, and it could be safe to go home. That we're not saying it meets that threshold where it'd be a safeguarding referral because it's not safe to go home. But if you're subjected to, or it let's again scenarios, and there's a million and one of these. So, but let's say, for instance, you're from the LGBTQ plus community, and you identify as something, a sex that you weren't born into, that could cause problems. The
Mm.
parents go, well, you can come home, but as long as you come home and don't behave like that.
Yeah.
We've had
Yeah.
that, and you're thinking, is that right? Is that appropriate? Is that so? It's this intentionality, or like you said, homelessness. Yeah, there is the term intentionality is misleading because it kind of says, I don't know of anyone that we've worked with that I know, whether through a professional career or from personal life, who has made themselves intentionally homeless. Now, they may not feel safe. Then some people who have been homeless for a while fear the system,
Yeah.
but and it's easy to bat these words around intentionality. And I think we've got to be careful of that. And I think what coming back to our unique selling point as the youth work sector, a lot of the time we've got this history of those young people and the journey making because we are working with them from the age of 11, 25. It may not be this team, but
Yeah.
you can speak with colleagues in the service throughout the sector and go, well, right, okay, where we're at that. So we've seen that these things don't appear out of nowhere. Now, let's take other professionals, which play a vital role in this regard, and I use housing officers as one. Sometimes they only come into a young person's life at a point of crisis. That young
Mm.
person is presenting as homeless. So there's a big catch up that they've got to play to understand the context. So we can give that context. We can give that history. We've got youth workers in schools, in communities, in one-to-one outreach. In terms of connected with or associated to youth justice work, and it's much more comprehensive. So we can start to do that. And when it becomes advocating on people's behalf for this, not only signposting but advocating, that's where I feel we come to the fore in terms of the support we provide to young people.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think Chris, you didn't allude to it, point blank said about collaboration being a really key driver in preventing youth homelessness. So how important is this? Can this be done in isolation, or does it actually require genuine support from other agencies to make this happen? And you know, for me, I have my personal view on this, but I sometimes see youth work as being the
Conduit.
holds. They are in the center of all of this. And then you've got these support agencies I would see on like the periphery, and I suppose from a young person's perspective, they always know they can come back to their youth worker, whether it's to do with youth homelessness or it could be to do with substance misuse, or they might be a young carer and things like that. So, yeah, how important is collaboration, networking, and multi-agency approaches to this?
Incredibly important. And from the powers perspective, like I said earlier, I think we've developed a reputation for being good at what we do in
Yeah.
terms of those relationships and being the trusted adult, in being a professional with equal standing with anybody else sitting around the table.
Mhm.
Because what we bring is different to social work, is different to teaching, is different to the police, etc., etc. And we're quite unique in that offer.
Yeah.
time-bound nature of many other services is also a key factor because they will open case, close case kind of
Yeah.
approach, which doesn't work because it's not a case of firefighting. You know,
Mm.
Nick mentioned about crisis point. Quite often we'll meet with young person at crisis point, but when they're not at crisis point, they may just be below that. They
Yeah.
may have loads of stuff going on, but it's not really incredibly bad at the moment. But tomorrow, maybe.
Yeah, but they could be at crisis for different reasons. They might not be a housing crisis, but they might be a mental health
Yeah.
crisis. So,
And
yeah.
they're all those issues are quite often linked. For example, to prison.
Yeah.
That affects their housing, that affects their benefits, it affects everything about that young person. Yeah, like I said earlier, quite often our multi-agency meetings will have, and maybe up to 12 different professionals coming together around a young
Yeah.
person that we're concerned for.
I would
Examples of those would be probation, would be youth
have.
justice, would be mental health, community mental health team, CAMS. We'll
Yeah.
work with housing officers. We'll work with social workers. We do a load of work with safeguarding officers, adult
Yeah.
and young people. And depending on the needs of the young people, quite often we will be the organization that pulls those people together. So
Yeah.
I'm not talking strategy meetings, social work strategy meetings with social workers, call, but I'm talking about interested groups that are working with a young person, and a coordinated approach in terms of everything that goes on for that young person would be hugely beneficial if those agencies and organizations spoke to each other
Yeah.
to help that young person. And we're seeing that to really good effect. And just to point out, the evolution that Nick was talking about recently. I've been in youth work 30 years plus now, which is quite scary. I never thought I'd be in 3 or 4 strategy safeguarding meetings on a weekly basis. That's where we're at now as a service.
Wow.
Um,
That's quite a
and
lot,
not
isn't it?
because when our role is being really valued and accepted in terms of what we can bring, but also in terms of lots of those young people's needs are a lot higher. We're dealing with issues with young people here that years ago I wasn't dealing with in Carmarthenshire or Bridgend. So you can see that escalation. And I think a lot of it's to do with young, maybe family is different these days.
Yeah.
We still live in a country where there's an expectation that young people have families to go home to. They have a house which is safe, which is warm, and which allows them to grow from. And that isn't the case for many young people now.
Yeah.
Going back to the Maslow, that pyramid. If you haven't got the base blocks in place, it's very difficult to grow from. And Nick
Yeah.
spoke about it earlier in terms of being safe, being secure, having food in your belly, and being in a good
Yeah.
place mentally so that you can go to the next level and develop and thrive. And a lot of our work is making sure that base level is in place for young people to hopefully step up and away from,
I mean, it's so serious work, isn't it? It's no laughing matter. This what we're in, and I really liked what you said about equal standing. You are up against, not up against. You are working with other professionals. And sometimes there is a parity discussion, isn't it, in terms of fairness and equity. If you're working with the police, you're working with social services and other sort of local authority housing officers. And I really like what you said about they seem to value that. And do you think that's a new thing? They're starting to see the value because of the amount of work that youth workers put in to a young person. And sometimes if you imagine a brick wall, they are sometimes that cement that puts the in between those bricks, isn't it, to build that wall? And do you think that's a new thing, or do you think that's always been the case? And whether that's backed up by the structures around it. When I say structured, I mean finance, funding support, government support. What are you experiencing on the ground? That warrants that sort of value.
I think our role has grown in terms of the knowledge of what we do and how we do it, partly through speaking to colleagues, partly
Yeah,
through necessity. In terms of you're working with a young person that I'm working with, we need to have a conversation. And that has grown over the last 6 years in Powys.
yeah,
The biggest thing, and I've spoken to you about this before, that is what's essential is colleagues in my team have a really strong relationship with colleagues in other areas. So much so that if I've got an issue, I've got named police officers that I can give a call to say,
Yeah.
can you help with this? Likewise, the police officers will give us a call saying, we need to get to this young person. Do
So
you know where
important.
they are? We can do that. Social work the same, safeguarding the same, probation the same, youth justice the same, and having knowledge of those people that you can pick up the phone to and say, help with this young person.
Yeah.
We're in a position now where people are saying, yes, of course we will, as opposed to what do you want? I'm not sure if I like the sound of that. So I think that's a really positive place to be. And it's something that constantly needs maintaining. And what I mean by that is change of staff, change of a member of staff, then we need to introduce ourselves to the new member of staff to re-establish that relationship. So yeah, it's challenge, but it works, I would say, and we're constantly growing and developing it.
And
Yeah.
I think, just to add to what Chris said there, I think take the sector as a whole now. We've learnt as the sector not just rely on anecdotal evidence. I think we're moving away from that. I think, we attended the Youth Homelessness Coordinators meeting the other day, where Welsh Government reported back all 22 local authorities now have early identification systems, serviced by youth sector provisions. Now,
That's massive.
that is huge. Each 22, now, we've been at this work relatively short period of time, I would say, in terms of what the development of youth work across the years. But we've learnt from that. The fact that we're at the coordinators meeting says, well, that's 22 local authorities working collaboratively. We've all been involved around this table now. We've all been involved in the national conference. We start to speak with one voice. We start to follow the evidence. When we identify deficits, we're starting to address that through training and so on. Now, what that does is give confidence from other professional stakeholders in our ability to play
Mm.
a proactive role. And also, we know, when we talk about signposting, that's great, but we know what the limits of our own skill sets are. You can't be everything to everyone. When we first come in, there was a lot of, I just speak, from my own personal experience, there was a lot of skepticism from other professional stakeholders, like, well, what, you're now going to come in and do my job, are you? No, that's not what we're going to do. What we're going to do is ease the process of and expedite how young people can access your services. You're
Mm.
still in charge of your services. What we do sometimes is advise services on how to become more engaging towards young people, how they can shape their services. We listen to young people and feed that back to services about how they've navigated those services. So again, in terms of, I do think there's parity with other professions now, because we're not trying to be those other professions. That is never going to work. I often say to friends and colleagues, when you talk about pie, psychologically informed environment, well, let's look at this as a piece of pie. It takes lots of ingredients. We may bring the
Mm.
meat. Someone else will bring the ingredients for the pastry. Someone else will make the sauce. That's what's needed.
Yeah.
Pie, we should be pie informed environment, but thinking, well, okay, what is it that I'm not very good at making crust. Going back to the army store, it's kind of basic training. There's people who can bull boots better than they can iron. So some people bull all the boots, some people do all the ironing. This is what we need to do. But I do think the message is coming over loud and clear. We're not just relying on anecdotal evidence. It's systematic. The fact that we say 22 local authorities have early identification systems, we come with that knowledge, skills, but resource as
Mm.
well. Welsh Government have invested in us, haven't they? They've
Yes.
invested in the fact that we've got these relationships. Now that's paying dividend. I was just reading yesterday the update on the child poverty strategy, the report for 2025. In it, it says across Wales that, it's been a 10% reduction in the number of families facing homelessness. Now, none of us around this table are happy with 10%, are we? We've got to be more ambitious than that. But just to say, we're leaps and bounds ahead of that. Yesterday the strategy in
Yeah.
England came out, and I'm not kind of dissing people across the border, but the strategy in England came out of their homelessness strategy, because it's going the other way. There's a rise in that, Now, first of all, we'd like more accelerated, reduction in these numbers, but now the infrastructure's there. We're working collaborative. As Chris said, you can pick up the phone and stuff, but and develop those relationships. People have got trust in that. But we bring expertise in terms of engaging people. We bring skills. We also bring resource because the Welsh Government have invested in us. So that's why people are
Mhm.
on board. Those numbers are coming down. These systems are emerging. They're effective. It's huge.
I think maybe there's been a shift, isn't it, between people thinking that youth work is that sort of traditional, young people around a pool table
Yeah.
and all the lovely stuff that is a significant part of youth work, but it isn't the only thing. And they're the vehicle that gets to the destination sometimes. But, it's so much more than that, isn't it? It's not just a case of, and I think that's being sort of valued across the board, isn't it?
Yeah.
You mentioned about, youth homelessness coordinators coming together. Obviously, we had a couple of successful conferences now, haven't we? That's been really good. But what I think that each year is identified, in my view, that there has been growth and there has been learning and there has been action. I think a
Absolutely.
really good example of that, and of course I'll mention this, but is the development of the training package that
Yeah.
we've got available for those going into the youth homelessness sort of sphere of working, but also those who want to go into that, and also those who are already in that sort of network space, really, isn't there?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm mindful, it's one of those things, like you said, that's the sector coming together, the sector identifying where there's a deficit, the sector working collaboratively to come up with answers to that, with solutions and rolling it out. And again, we've learned from the past, haven't we? It's kind of saying, right, wait a minute. We've got to give people, the youth workers of tomorrow listening to this, who
Yeah.
are going to pursue this career, you can have confidence in the fact that we will give you the skills needed to undertake this role. We will, and you'll get core foundation skills in any youth work course, but then a few specialists not to be housing officers, but to be effective youth workers in this arena. That's where it's coming from. It's written, by youth workers for youth workers. That's where it's come, but it's informed by practice and informed by young people. Some of these journeys that they're going on. And I think, again, we as a sector have learnt from the past and we're putting it out there now that, we talk about collaborations, but we kind of lost it over COVID, didn't we? People become, isolated silos and some of those things. I think this is an example where we've surpassed any practice that happened before COVID in this regard.
Yeah, and just for listeners who are listening to this, in terms of available training and learning that's available, if you visit the ETS Eventbrite, you'll see a list of youth homelessness related training that's available. Some of which is the trainer, which I for, which seems a bit pointless me mentioning that, but you'll notice that there is efforts to do that. And also we're looking at other sort of training that's available as well, in terms of some of the workshops that are on offer at the conference are also being delivered throughout the year. So some really good stuff around elective home education, suicide prevention, all real key things that is really important for us to know about. So if you're a youth worker or a practitioner working with young people interested in this, I'll put the link in the description box for you to have a look at. Please engage with us in training. It's professional learning at any stage of your career is really, really important to make sure that we're still current, competent at supporting young people. But also, we talk about collaboration quite a lot as well, and we can learn from others. So it's one of the things that's been really useful in this podcast is obviously Nick and Chris both working in sort of rural-ish areas, but both have different ways of working, but equally both can share good practices with working with young people at risk of youth homelessness, or preventing young people to become at risk of youth homelessness. And I think that is the key thing. I suppose if people are listening who are in influential positions, should we say, whether that's money making decision makers or political decision makers, what should they know? What should they take away as a result of listening to this podcast? What more needs to be done just to make sure that we carry on doing what we're doing or accelerate what we're doing?
Do you want me to start there?
Go for
Got
Chris.
I think that politicians and people with the purse strings don't recognize that young people are on a conveyor belt. we kind of do in schools, in
Yeah.
that with a school, they go from year to year until 16 or 18 when they eventually leave. But each year they move on,
Yeah.
on that conveyor belt of life.
Yeah.
So when there's a social deficit identified, such as housing, youth homelessness, and the things that are attached to that. It's no good just saying, well, we're going to do something about this now, because now is going to be here every day going forward, next year
Yeah.
and the year after. So a pot of funding to deal with the now doesn't solve the conveyor belt, which is backing up behind with young people who are coming from the same issues, the same poverty levels, the same challenges in life, which have led to the current young people who are homeless being homeless or having those challenges.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unless we recognize that it's something which we continuously need to fund and resource, then we're on that peaks and troughs. And what I mean by that is it's short-term funding, it's time-bound, because after that, then it's going to be solved. Well, we know it's not. So I think the long-term agenda is really important. And unfortunately, we see it in local politics, in national politics, in worldwide politics. The 4-year cycle. We've got elections next year. What does that hold? But the 4-year cycle depends on whether money is going to go in one direction or another. That would be my plea, is recognizing that the needs aren't going to go away in a political cycle, that the funding and the needs of those families are key, and that we recognize that if one young person has experienced this from a particular community, the likelihood is that the young people in that community are experiencing the same. Therefore, it's possible that they may have those homeless issues, those education employment issues, those
Yeah.
mental health issues, and everything else that goes with it. So that would be my suggestion there.
I think it's worth noting that at one stage, homelessness might dip quite considerably, but we know that that's not how life works, and it will unfortunately rise. Nick, you've written
Yeah.
quite a lot around this sort of area. You've written a few papers, and it'd be
Yeah.
good to put them in the description, actually, in terms of, and you mentioned, I think one of you mentioned about Professor Howard written a few papers on this, and we'll put that in the description box. But I wonder what your take on sort of, a plea, because you see, I think it's fair to say, Nick, that you've done a lot nationally for youth homelessness, and I think you've been a very good driver with this. So I wonder what your take is on that.
Well, one, I fully endorse Chris's plea there because, just to reiterate, not to go over what he said, but just to reiterate a few points before I move on to something else. This short-term funding doesn't work for a number of reasons, as we know, and normally means it's tipped in the balance of crisis intervention. But for us to come up with meaningful interventions, look, the 22 systems we talked about there, 22 early identification systems, has taken a lot to get to.
Yeah.
We've got to get buy-in. We've got to understand how young people navigate this system, listen to young people, empower them to be part of coming up with the solutions. That takes time because relationships aren't built overnight.
No, you're
So
right.
that's where, so I kind of, one, fully endorsed kind of Chris's plea. For me, prevention. Now, there's some things in the new bill that's going through and so on that puts emphasis on prevention. The youth work sector works best as a preventative model. This early identification, get in early, tell people the consequences, understand them, start averting that. I'll tell an anecdotal story just to highlight the impact of prevention. So when I first come into the homelessness agenda and started working on it, I had come off the back of some prevention projects I'd done, worked closely with the fire service around road safety and stuff. So I asked a colleague and a friend who worked in the fire service if I could borrow a firefighter's uniform, full BA and stuff. And I went in to speak to fellow professionals from across a range of professional stakeholders on youth homelessness, but I didn't reference why I was dressed in full firefighter's uniform with BA. It was the elephant in the room, right? And at the end, kind of people didn't want to say, what is that? Now, I done it because the fire service have a brilliant example of where prevention has been key. Years ago, firefighters, the service would go out, they'd fight fires. People were dying through fires, and firefighters were put at risk because firefighters were dying in their duty of fighting fires. So they was like, what can we do here? So they started to come up with teams that went out and changed people's open chip pans, if you remember, to deep fat fryer clothes, things that you do, put smoke detectors in. Old people, instead of warming their feet by a little bar fire in front of them, were given electric blankets to keep them warm. Now, At first, the people on the front line, the firefighters who were active in the station, sat there going, bloody hell, it's a bit fluffy, that stuff there, because, we're on the front line and we're having to deal with this and the risk of going out and getting called out. Now, we move to the modern day. The fire service attend more road traffic accidents than they do fires now.
Yeah, yeah,
They're no longer losing those firefighters, unfortunately, or as many firefighters in these huge incidents of fire. And of course it'll still happen, but because their prevention agenda said, why don't we start from a position of preventing the fires in the first place?
yeah.
Hang on.
And I
Genius.
suppose they put, they're very good at strategic, position in terms of influencing those to help with regulation, with building safety regs and things like that, isn't it? So it's a good example of that.
Brilliant. That's the example. Right, okay. So we should speak as a collective voice for prevention. And we do when we have direct contacts, and Welsh Government listen, and they're part of our planning processes, and they're part of the conference stuff and all. Do you know what I mean? That's valuable. We have a direct line in of the things coming out. How can we help inform legislation?
Yeah.
In terms of prevention, let's get in. Like you said, 22, and it sounds like I'm a parrot here, kind of, a broken record saying 22 local authorities have early identification systems where information shared across a number of professional stakeholders to identify who's at highest risk as early as possible so we can get in. If we can turn that tap off, inevitably we reduce the numbers. Now, there's always going to be crisis, of course. No one's naive enough to think it isn't. But if we can reduce the numbers, reduce the risk, if young people can play an active role and they know they're familiar with the services that they'll need, do you mean appropriate support at the appropriate time by the appropriate service? If they're aware of that, they've got those relationships, and we've broken down the barriers between them and if we can, we've got a housing and homelessness forum at Youth Forum, and they reviewed the application process for housing here in Pembrokeshire. It was a 19-page document. It uses professional terminology. Even the colours didn't work for some young people. They just offered that constructive criticism, but also offered some solutions as well of using digital technology to overcome some of these things, to talk about some of the language that's understandable to them. Young people are part of the solution to do that and involve them meaningfully in a prevention agenda. Not only do we want to identify those people very early on, prevention, also include them in helping to prevent it in the future. When young people present as homeless, often the professionals are the last person to know. Their peers are their first people to know. So we have to ensure that they're part of that system. So a plea to anyone is, don't dismiss the power of prevention agenda. The Welsh Government, there seems to be, I've acknowledged that, but in that it takes time. There's longevity, and people have often thought, well, if we put in prevention, when do we start to see those dividends? Let's use things like the fire service there that have shown us the way here and have said, right, hang on, it's been very effective. Yes, use those principles.
Yeah. No, that's a really good sentiment as well, isn't it? I don't know, Chris, if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I was thinking of the pathways for young people to become independent. And unfortunately, the benefits trap, as it's been termed, is a real one. Paid jobs, paid work, quite often part-time work,
Yeah.
or work that may get a young person into the job market and standing on their own 2 feet, is a real difficult step for so many young people to take. Partly welcomed the announcements by the Prime Minister last week about helping young people into employment and into training and things along those lines. But I think there needs to be some work done in terms of what a young person actually needs to go from being on benefits to being independent. They've upped the rate of for minimum wage, which is good, but not good for small businesses who are just trying to break through. Often with large employers, when you up the rate of minimum wage, that means they lay people off because they can't afford the increased costs.
Yeah.
But in terms of young people, when they're on housing benefit, when they may have PIP coming in, when they may have other UC claims, etc. We had a young person, for example, who was chuffed to beans because she'd got herself a job and she was absolutely over the moon. And she was earning about £1,000 a month, £1,000 a month. But her actual costs a month were £1,400.
Yeah.
Although she's done fantastic to get the job, the job wouldn't pay for her to stay in her flat. So then we've got a young person then who's potentially needs to leave her accommodation because now she can't afford it. And in a similar way as well, in terms of that, when they get a job, the benefits stop. So they're a month behind before they get any pay. So they're already in debt before they've even got their first pay packet. So I think in terms of the funders and decision makers, making an easier pathway for young people to get off benefits and into paid employment where they're paying their way would be a significant step for helping many young people in that transition from being homeless or vulnerably housed into being independent, autonomous, and living life the way they should be, with freedom and with money in their pocket, really, like, you know.
I suppose it helps that sort of, that resilience within the economy as well, isn't it? More people working, more people paying into the system. But obviously, the structure around that currently is challenging for young people. Look, I'm conscious of time, so I always have two questions that I give to guests before they leave us. And I'll start with the more sort of negative question, then we'll end on the positive. So, I suppose from your perspective, of what scares you about the future, what you're least looking forward to. You can use examples, within your own organisation or nationally or politically or wherever. So, Nick, if it's okay, I'll go to you first, and then I'll go to you then, Chris.
Scares me, and this isn't a political point, but it's a point that shows the problem with our system. We've got elections coming up and so on, and it's that change of regime. I'm not suggesting whether there's a change of political party or not, but all of a sudden, inevitably things change. Whether the political party change, whether cabinet changes, whether the people at the top change in their roles, and we start again. That's a big fear. We've made progress. We are making progress. Let's stick to that, and it's linked to Chris's point here, Jimmy, in terms of investing in this. We longevity. All that what we're putting in place now, we're building for the future. We'll start paying dividends. We've said this about youth work many a time.
Yeah.
Sometimes you see that the benefits years on, but we need that. So it's kind of what I don't want to see, and it's a big fear of mine, is a change of direction for whatever reason at a political level.
Yeah. And what's your sort of thing that scares you, Chris?
Cost of living, rising costs, and not equating money to that cost of living in people's pockets, which puts more pressure on families, more pressure on households. And to tap on to Nick's point there, I think the way the Welsh government has funded what we do has been really helpful and useful in driving the agenda, in that it's specific money which comes to local authorities to deliver specific things. A bit of a fear of mine is that money gets put into the revenue support grant, which then is up to local consideration. So, and young people, we all know young people don't vote in the same numbers that retired and older people do. So therefore, they're not a priority in terms of votes and decisions around attracting votes. So yeah, my fear is similar to Nick in terms of that money potentially being either stopped or put into RSG, which then will change 22 versions of what the Welsh government is pushing towards in terms of youth homelessness. So yeah, those are my fears, I think.
Yeah, and I think they're genuine fears as well, that not only you fear that, I think many across the sector do as well. And I suppose to end on a positive, we've got to try our best to be optimistic about the future, despite some of its challenges. So what's exciting about the future, and what can we look forward to? What's there to be positive about? So I'll go back to you, Chris, and then end with you, Nick. So Chris, there must be something positive to look forward to.
I think people pulling together and working together in a collective framework, for want of a better description, around a young person. So putting what we're doing in Powys, and thinking many other counties across Wales, is putting the young person in the centre and the services around them, as opposed to our being service-led. And if we work in that way, which is very youth work driven, person-centred, needs-based, working, and the young people choosing to work with us, I think that's a really firm foundation for improvement and for not just the young people's development, but how local authorities work with young people as well. So that would be my hope for the future. Thanks, Darryl.
Well, thank you, Chris and Nick.
This is an exciting time to be in the youth work sector in Wales, isn't it? I mean, there are huge leaps forward. Look, we've still, there's a political investment, there's a political understanding the value of youth work in Wales, across the board, and across all parties. I feel from the interim board to the implementation board to where we are now in terms of working towards that national body for youth work in Wales. Really exciting. Young people's rights are at the forefront. It's hugely exciting. The fact that you talk about as the training in this regard, that the level 3 that's been devised, that's a prime example where we are now working as one unit. It's a relatively small nation, Wales. Your post, Darryl, is exciting. This is where we needed that kind of coordination there, but it's been put on the agenda, and people have risen to that challenge, aren't they? We're working collectively.
100%.
These things now are examples of we're speaking with one voice. It's really exciting, and from a selfish perspective of being a practitioner working in the youth work sector, yeah, for us, but broadly. And what we're really here for is it's exciting for young people as well, then, because they're getting to a point where they're getting the service they deserve, they need, they trust, they value.
100%. And what a good thing to end on, I think, both, from both of your exciting points. And I just want to say thank you for joining us. We spoke very eloquently and candidly about some of the challenges that we face, but also some of the positives in terms of what we're doing to help with youth homelessness. And although we probably never be able to eradicate it, despite, people like the royal family waiting in on this subject and, and sort of trying to influence on that scale, obviously the sheer complexity around this issue just isn't going to go away, unfortunately, and it takes people like you to help that situation massively. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for joining us. And for those who are listening, if you like the episode, please press the like button, and always feel free to comment on the platform that you're listening from. But also a big plea from me, we're really trying to increase our YouTube following so we can do more YouTube live videos. So in the future, that would be a feature that we'd like to do. To do that, we need more subscribers. So please subscribe, get others to subscribe. We would appreciate it. But also in the long run, it means that we can do some YouTube live videos, maybe a bit more reactive in what we're doing. So feel free to like and comment and share this widely. If you've got any podcast ideas, please get in touch. I'm more than happy to hear from you. And that's it from this week's episode. Thank you for listening. This is Youth Work, the podcast that's been delving into the lives of youth workers, their journeys, and work with young people. And we'll see you next time. Thank you both.
Thank you, Darryl. Thank you, Nick.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks for listening to This is Youth Work. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to receive notifications on future episodes. If you like what you're hearing, don't forget to press the like button.